had mammoth, mastodon, ground sloth. They were attracted to the salt springs, the saline springs there at Big Bone Lick. Animals would go there to feed, and that's where they became prey for what we call these Paleo-Indian hunters. They were the original pioneers of Kentucky. They were the first hunters to come in to Kentucky. They developed a very, very specialized tool called the Clovis point, and we know these as the Clovis people. This was a very, very efficient killing point. I mean, this was made to bring down big game animals. They chose the best rocks or the best chert that they could find. It's a fine grain material. It's got like little quartz crystals in it. It will break in a predictable manner.
Now, how long would it take for a skilled craftsman to knock one of these out?
From start to finish, maybe 20 minutes. This would have been used probably with thrusting spears, possibly throwing spears. A group of hunters would have gotten together, maybe isolated a mammoth or a mastodon in one of these salt springs, and it would have taken a group effort. They probably snuck up on these animals from behind. They probably got gut shots or belly shots on them. And the way these things worked was they were on a foreshaft, and this thing would go in, and then the big spear would break off. They could then reload another point onto their spear and repeat this, because it probably took hours for one of these animals to die.
Wow. An addle. Now that seemed to be a pretty efficient way to get something moving pretty fast using physics. I mean, sounds like you could really put the wallop on something with one of these.
Yes, you could. The addle, what it was an extension of your arm. The bow didn't come around for a long time in Kentucky. So the addle was the preferred hunting mechanism.
Yeah, I can imagine them having games and
sure.
and you know, cheering each other on, laughing at each other, and trying to get. And there probably some guys are really good at it.
The fact that these were buried with people, just the fact that when they laid someone to rest and they put these things with them, I think that really tells how important these things were to their daily lives. 12 to 1300 years ago, that's when the bow gets introduced into Kentucky. It totally changed the way people hunted, because if you think about it, the bow and arrow enabled a hunter to hunt in solitude. You didn't have to go out with a group anymore. And the other thing is the force and distance. An addle, they're throwing from 30 and 60 feet. You would have had to gotten really close to your prey to take it down. With the bow, you were afforded distance and, again, that solitude.
During that period of time, I can imagine an Indian scampering up a tree, getting on a low branch and waiting, you know.
Mm-hmm.
That's the vantage point.
Sure.
I mean, as we use today, we have tree stands, but I know plenty of guys who don't hunt with tree stands. They climb up a tree and wait, find a big branch and just stand out there. I can see that happening.
That would have been exactly what I would envision.
Now, during that period of time, what would they hunt?
The white-tailed deer and the wild turkey become extremely important food sources for these people.
They took every part and parcel of this animal and used it for something. Can you tell us, for an example, if they brought a deer into camp, how many things could they make out of this deer? I mean, from everything from...
You make your clothing and your shoes out of the leather. They use the antler to make arrow points. They use the bone to make needles and awls. They use the sinew as hafting material. And that's pretty much, the animal. And then, of course, you've got the brains were probably used for tanning hides.
How would they preserve their meat, or did they pretty much use it as they got it? I mean,
that's another good question, Tim. If you had a really good hunt and a guy's brought back a couple of deer, some of it's processed and eaten right away, and then they would have set up drying racks, so they were making jerky.
A lot of people have this utopian vision of peace and harmony. They were out there killing each other. When I was a kid, I found a skull with a couple of these in it. Now, there was some bad business going on.
Well, think about it. The stone, the animals, the water. You're competing for these resources, so conflict did occur. And, that's human nature.
Right.
Yes, the Indians were here, but who else was here? The French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the English. And these are the people that introduced, you know, the firearms to these people. The first guns introduced to Native Americans in Kentucky probably came from the French.
Now, that had to change their game quite a bit.
Oh, sure. I would say around the mid to late 1600s here in Kentucky, they were introduced to these European firearms, but what you have to realize is that the Indian probably served as the middleman. So say you've got some stuff coming from the east or the west, a group of Native Americans that trusted the Europeans would have gone, maybe traded some of their goods for the firearms, and then the firearms were brought into the Indian groups by the Indians themselves, and then the people that probably used them were probably the higher status people in that group. So maybe the best hunter, maybe the guy that was the most important person in that group, those were the people that got to use the guns. But what I really find fascinating is that at one point you would have people living in the same village and they were carrying guns and bows and arrows. And I find that fascinating.
By the 1760s, you had a whole new type of American hunter called the long hunter. Long hunters were known for their duration of hunt. They would be away for a long time, and they would travel typically great distances. These men would go in pack horses with their supplies and bring back hundreds and thousands of deer, and that was the exchange, typically in the more settled areas. So it's massive amounts of deer skin. They're not eating the deer. It was very, very common to just come upon numbers of deer carcasses that were just rotting. The deer skins were imported throughout Europe. It was a massive industry, and nobody really thought about any hint of conservation. It was puzzling to the Indians. How do you deal with these men? For every deer that fell to a long hunter gun could have fallen to an Indian gun. And so it was a two-edged sword. As the traders would come in, they would bring in new commodities, blankets, they would bring in beads, they would bring in wool, they would bring in trade silver, and so these are desirable things. Tea, oftentimes, the liquor trade was extensive. And so basically what happens is you began to have conflicts. They would shoot 9, 10, 12 buffalo, take all the tongues, leave the rest to rot. They'd see another drove maybe the next day, maybe later that afternoon, do the same thing, take the tongues, leave the rest to rot. And that's, you know, in a drove that size, you're taking maybe 7 to 12 tons of meat. And then within 2 or 3 days, they would complain from lack of food.
How many buffalo died because of that? Just that piece of meat right there.
Well, if you would be talking about the entire United States, I would say 20 to 30 million for the tongue. This is the buffalo tongue. This is pretty hot, but this is the most succulent part of the buffalo. It's high in fat, high in protein. Kind of the Atkins diet of the frontier, and it had a sweet, buttery kind of taste. We can eat some. I don't know if you want to.
You know what? Why don't you slice me off a piece? I want to see.
All right.
I want to see what this tastes like.
That's the best cut of the meat.
Wow.
Good?
Wow. I'm astounded.
Right.
Now, we got some other parts and pieces here that were
Sure.
valued as well. They like the bone marrow.
The bone marrow was just about as much as a delicacy as the tongue. The problem with the bone marrow was getting to it, because it's in the femur and the shank bones. You got to get them, you got to bust them open, and it tastes very, very similar. And again, like the tongue, the marrow is going to be primarily fat. It's tough to get to them. You've got to bust them open with axes or rocks or whatever, and just throw them on the fire and cook it. That's the interior of the bone.
Oh, and that is good.
With the marrow bones, there's several accounts of men that would begin eating marrow, and it's like they couldn't stop eating it.
Now, when was the last sighting again of the buffalo in Kentucky?
Well, the actual last documented sighting that can be verified was in 1802 by André Michaud, who was a French botanist, and this is in the area of Green River. Now, there was several taverns, like around Lexington and Midway and Paris, Kentucky, and so forth, that specialized in buffalo steaks. By 1810, 1812, they no longer had them on the menu because they couldn't get them. And so you can kind of infer then that they were, you know, if not gone, pretty well diminished, shot out.
Now, what about records of elk? When did they start to disappear?
Well, the elk is a little bit more problematic in my opinion, to talk about because the records are a little bit vaguer. But again, by the time of statehood, 1792, the elk were thinning dramatically. I think that the last Kentucky sighting of elk is in the 1840s, 1850s.
What was the most wasteful thing that happened?
Every March, April, May, they would fire up the cane lands. They would just destroy literally thousands of acres of cane. You can read the accounts where the fires would burn at night. They would burn uncontrollably. They would sweep cabins. And so they were just, the most wasteful practice was probably not hunting, even though that was incredibly wasteful. But it was a combination of that plus the destruction of the habitat. And there was always rapacious hunting. There was always overkilling. There was no regard to hunting seasons and gestation periods. You had that. But probably the breeds could have survived if they would have maintained some sense of habitat, and they didn't.
Daniel Boone saw the effects of overharvest and tried to introduce early legislation to control hunting in Kentucky.
By the time you get into the 1780s and by statehood, you have the buffalo, just small droves here and there, 20 and 30 head. And then really by about 1800, they're pretty much gone.
Now, a lot of people don't realize that Boone was one of our earliest conservationists and tried to protect habitat and the dwindling buffalo herd. Now, fast forward to the 20th century. The elk and buffalo have disappeared from Kentucky. Deer are only seen in small localized areas, and turkeys are essentially gone.
With all my heart and soul, with every particle of high purpose that is in me, I pledge you my word to do everything I can to put every particle of courage, of common sense, and of strength that I have at your disposal.
President Theodore Roosevelt became the most recognized conservationist of the 20th century as he protected wetlands and established the National Park System. In Kentucky, J. Quincy Ward from Cynthiana was quick to recognize the need for a Game and Fish Commission, and in 1912, the agency began its first unsteady steps towards today's Department of Fish and Wildlife.
The Fish and Wildlife, before it became Fish and Wildlife, was under the Department of Agriculture. And it was just fish stocking and law enforcement.
After the fledgling division conducted a study in 1915 and determined deer were almost extinct in Kentucky, they decided to protect them by not having a deer hunting season.
Well, there were places all over the state where you didn't see a deer, not just eastern Kentucky, but of course that was the place where they were pretty much decimated by the turn of the century. And it was a lot of hard work on the part of a lot of folks, the department people, and the sportsmen and women really came through and you know, they ponied up money through the Pittman-Robertson Act for wildlife restoration, buying shotgun shells and rifles and so on and so forth. And we physically caught and moved those deer. And a lot of people don't know that we have to catch them in drop nets or rocket nets and fight them and wrestle them and load them up in trailers and transport them across the state and turn them loose. And it's no easy undertaking. Most of the deer originally came out of land between the lakes.
1946 was the first legal deer hunt in 30 years. And we saw an early need to purchase land also for conserving Kentucky's natural resources.
The second oldest wildlife management area we have in the state of Kentucky is actually Beaver Creek, which is in eastern Kentucky, and it was bought and established as a refuge to turn some of these deer and turkeys loose on so that they'd be protected until they could flourish.
Where did turkey come from?
We caught a lot of turkeys in state, and they're tough to catch too. You have to feed them in and shoot a rocket net over them, and it's pretty traumatic for the birds and the people fighting to get them in the boxes.
Something you and I have watched with teary eyes is bringing these elk back.
The elk are the reason that I came to Kentucky. I thought as an up-and-coming biologist in college that all the cool things had been done. Deer had been brought back, turkeys that were brought back, all the, bears were recovering, and all the big species that everybody likes to see and go hunt had been restored. So when I saw the opportunity to help restore elk in eastern Kentucky, I couldn't pass it up. But it's probably single-handedly one of the largest, most complex restoration efforts that's ever been undertaken in this country, because we physically caught and relocated with tractor trailers more than 1,500 elk from 2,500 miles away. 6 or 7 year process of identifying those animals, finding states that were willing to give them up. We had to capture those animals with a variety of methods, everything from tranquilizer guns to corral traps to net gunning out of helicopters, which is extremely dangerous but effective, and then load them all up a trailer at a time and ship them back to Kentucky. A number of obstacles we went through, but it was certainly well worth it. Now we have a herd of probably close to 7,000 animals and growing, and everything's looking up there.
When I was growing up in eastern Kentucky, we had squirrels, and if you're lucky, a few grouse, and that was it. We grew up hunting that small game, and we enjoyed it so much. What's being done to bring them back?
Well, you're exactly right. As much difficulty and as many obstacles as we had to overcome to restore turkeys and deer and elk, now bears are coming back. All the big species are coming back and doing well. We've now run up against our biggest challenge, and that's how do we bring back the small game populations in this state. We have a tremendous loss of habitat on a daily basis due to uncontrolled development. We have issues across the state, really, with our farms being broken up and sold off, or our farms being consolidated into larger and larger farms, which ultimately, when they become, they start practicing clean farming practices, you lose the hedgerows and the fence rows that bobwhite quail and rabbits love. You lose the ability to manage that property as probably our grandparents did when they had the smaller family farms. So we've tried for years and years. We tried active stocking of things like bobwhite quail and pheasants and so on and so forth, and it just really doesn't work if you don't put the habitat there. We really have to start focusing on creating good habitat in the east for quail and for grouse. We have to do some timber management on our wildlife management areas and on private lands, and do good responsible timber management in the central and western part of the state for bobwhite quail and rabbits. We really have to start focusing on grassland restoration and burning of grasslands to make sure that they produce the types of places that those species can thrive. When you put good habitat on the ground and you manage it, then you have the best chance that we'll ever have of bringing back those species. And that's really the biggest challenge I can tell you over the last 100 years of wildlife management from a historical perspective through modern time. Putting back deer was easy, comparatively speaking. Putting back elk was easy. Putting back turkeys was easy. Even though we had all those challenges, bobwhite quail, ruffed grouse, and rabbits are going to be the mountain that we've got to climb now. In order to continue to perpetuate our hunting tradition, our hunting culture, we've got to get small game back on the landscape, and we've got to get kids going out there and getting after them, because that's our future.